continuing our coverage of the ongoing refugee crisis, we thought we would reconnect with Eric Maddox, who we spoke to in late September. Eric is director of Open Roads Media, and he is the founder and executive director of the Virtual Dinner Guest Project. For the last number of weeks, he has been in Turkey, and he has been following this issue very closely from there. Eric, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me back.
So what are you hearing now in terms of, we've had a lot of coverage in this country and on this program of the political situation here in the U.S., the way people are reacting to the refugee crisis, especially in the wake of the Paris terror attacks. First of all, I guess let's start with this. What are you hearing about the situation inside Syria, since it's tough to get news here about Syria itself?
Sure, and that's a great question that I absolutely welcome. And it's true. It's a difficult place to get news out of these days. There's some social media outlets that people can check. Good Morning Syria, I believe, is one of them. A Facebook page people can refer to where they actually translate content from Arabic into English on a daily basis. And that's just a free social media platform. So a lot of the information people are going to have access to is not necessarily going to be found through traditional media, which means that, of course, people should exercise their own caution and discretion in trusting those sources. But that would be one that I would recommend. As far as what's going on inside Syria, I don't know that a whole lot has changed significantly since the last time we spoke, other than the Russian campaign, which is a significant development. I don't believe that was going on the last time we spoke, back in September. And that's playing out on the ground in various ways. That's another major global power that is not necessarily aligned with U.S. interests, putting their dogs in the fight. And some of the criticisms focused at Russian policy in Syria, and specifically at the airstrikes, is that they are not necessarily focusing on Islamic State. They're focusing on whomever they determine to be opposed to the Assad regime. For those that aren't well aware of Russia's stake in the region, they're a long-standing ally of the Assad family. So going back to before Bashar al-Assad to Hafez al-Assad, his father. So Russia's got a long-standing interest in relationship with Syria, and although in some ways they're suggesting that they're aligned with this campaign against Islamic State, some of the criticisms focused against them suggest that they're actually more interested in doing whatever it takes to keep Assad in power, and that their primary targets might not actually be Islamic State on the ground.
So you have this kind of, on a global scale, this kind of tripartite, this kind of three-party, at least. There are many more than that, but you have the U.S. and its interests focused on defeating and destroying ISIS. You have Assad looking to stay in power, and you have Russia basically aligned more with Assad than with destroying the Islamic State as a priority. So it's certainly complicated, and meanwhile we're seeing this outflow of refugees who have been, I guess you're probably in the country with the largest number of them right now. They're also transiting into Europe and attempting to get sanctuary in the United States as well. But what's the situation there? Have you gotten any sense of the mood in Europe, or for that matter in Turkey, about refugee resettlement in the wake of the Paris attacks?
Sure. So I would say that where my feelers are at this moment is through a social media page that I put up shortly before we talked last, the Refugee Relief Action Forum. And it's just a Facebook group that's now grown to roughly getting close to about 4,000 people from all over the place, throughout the Middle East and North Africa, but also North America, Europe, etc., and Pakistan, all over the place. So I'm kind of keeping up with information just from other people who are on the ground in some of these places. I've only got one set of eyes. So as far as the immediate impact of the Paris attacks, and I want to remind the international community and the American community as well that there were attacks before that in Beirut as well, pretty devastating bombings outside of a Palestinian refugee camp in a predominantly Shia neighborhood. And one of the things that I've been seeing pretty consistently is outrage that one set of attacks seems to be getting all kinds of attention, and the other one, which was absolutely devastating in Lebanon, isn't.
Yeah.
There are a variety of explanations people might offer for that. One might just be that that's just the reputation Lebanon has, so it hardly registers on people's radars. Other people just cite outright bigotry. Um, so I would call people's attention to that. And pre-dating the attack in Beirut, you also had the downing of the Russian airliner in the Sinai in Egypt and killing hundreds of people instantly. So, I mean, that's all background, and these are all claimed by Islamic State. So this is all background, this is all context for the Paris attacks that I think it needs to be appreciated. So as far as the kind of buzz that I'm seeing through social media and just personal interactions with people involved with the issue, there's frustration that people are failing to appreciate the context, that there's more or less a Paris-sized attack happening in Syria on a daily basis, to
Right.
put things in perspective as far as the numbers. But that's just kind of a black hole to a lot of people as far as their media consumption and even access to information.
Yeah, you raise a great point. We're talking with Eric Maddox, director of Open Roads Media and the Virtual Dinner Guest Project, who is in Turkey right now. You make a great point. I mean, I would say even that this program has probably been guilty of not mentioning, for example, the Beirut attack enough because, like a lot of in this case, I think like a lot of people, progressives, for lack of a better term, in this country, we tend to react to the political debate, but the political debate is, and I need to be more conscious of that personally, the political debate is driven to a large extent by the biases of the media and the political elite. So, for example, the horrific events in Beirut aren't on the radar because of those prejudices. They don't spark any reactions from Hillary Clinton or much less Donald Trump or Ben Carson or whomever. So we've got to stop, I think, we in this case being U.S. progressives especially, have to stop being driven by that and start being driven more by our own sense of morality and the outrage that takes place when there is something like the horrific attack in Beirut, or for that matter, the attack that's we're just learning more about now in Mali. So I think that's a great point, Eric. Thanks for that.
Of course. I would say that to kind of maybe go back and put a more human face on some of the sectarian stuff that we were talking about in the beginning. I mean, just all the different stakeholders that you mentioned. There's Russia, there's also the US, and then, of course, there's Iran, which is on the face of things, absolutely allied with the Assad regime, and then their affiliate in Lebanon, Hezbollah, and its involvement as well in that theater on the pro-Assad side. And I mean, who's to say how much even all of the people that are ostensibly allied are on the same page with one another? I mean, on the other side of that camp would be the U.S. and the Gulf countries. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that some of the Gulf countries that we call at least our nominal allies have played some role in filtering weapons and certainly poisonous ideology into the region going back decades before this conflict
Absolutely.
even started.
And
So
for
all of
that,
that needs to be
yeah,
considered in context.
yeah.
As far as the Beirut attacks are concerned, um, I think you make an absolutely valid point about as far as the political concerns and landscape in the U.S. and how that informs media bias and how that can be kind of self-perpetuating. I think there's another factor to consider. The neighborhood that this took place in is predominantly Shia.
Hmm.
I've spent quite a fair amount of time in that area myself, and I've had interactions with the security on the ground in that area, and they are Hezbollah. So the one of the bombers who was trying to get into a mosque in this Shia district was actually tackled by a local guy who, when they both hit the ground together, the vest detonated and killed both of them. This local guy gave his life and probably saved dozens, if not more, people. But you look at the funeral pictures after the fact, and his coffin's draped in Hezbollah flags, and this diminishes this guy's humanity in some people's eyes.
Mm.
Think what you will about the organization. The guy committed a selfless act.
Well, absolutely, and we've seen that elsewhere where there have been attacks on Shia mosques or communities in other parts of the world as well. Pakistan, we've seen there have been other cases of individual heroism like that. And the other thing that I wanted to run by you, Eric, I mean, I have a strong sense. You hear this even among liberals or self-described liberals. This notion, well, these Shiites and Sunnis have been fighting each other for centuries and it's not going to stop now. But I think if you look at the history of that region, there was very little Shia Sunni conflict before other countries, including, frankly, the United States, in an attempt to get at the Soviet Union, started, and of course, Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, started funding sectarian groups back in the 1980s in a big way. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
Uh, I would say that if we're going to pull back and look at history and what the precursors are for like the I don't know the sectarian tensions in the region are, we need to look at also how the borders were formed that cut
Yeah,
across sectarian lines and divisions and were created almost universally, without exception, without the consent of the governed. Right? There's a very different history of how that those nations were formed, and the sense of nationalism is in a lot of cases forced on them by autocrats.
right.
So, if I had to direct anybody's attention to a single historical moment, I'd go back almost exactly 100 years to something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement,
Right.
which was an agreement between the French and the British as the Ottoman Empire was starting to implode. This is during the First World War, and negotiating how they're going to divide up the spoils of what was this, more than 4 centuries long empire that ruled over a lot of the Arab countries in the greater Middle East.
And Iraq is a good example of that, I think, from what I understand, because you have a primarily Kurdish region, a primarily Sunni region, and then majority Shia elsewhere and in the country overall, right? So there was perhaps a lack of internal cohesion there. It's not really a country; it's an artificial border.
I mean, I would leave it up to, and I'm sure you would too, like I would leave it up to Iraqis now to decide how strongly they feel about keeping their borders. But the idea that it's a Western construct is just a historical fact. It was not a country that was created by and for Iraqis. It was a conception of Western interests.
Yeah.
And this is true of other places throughout the region. I mean, you also have the relocation of an incentivized relocation of certain populations within these borders. Saddam Hussein in his day was Arabizing certain parts of Iraq that might not have had like a significant enough Arab presence because of the different cultural divisions you're talking about. So there's like those small like historical footnotes that actually have maybe a lot of resonance uh, in the current moment. Syria, I mean, highly sectarian country. So you have like this small Alawi, which I guess the best way to describe it is a sect within Shia Islam,
Hmm.
which in some ways explains like their support from Iran and Hezbollah. So they are a small sect, much like Saddam's Sunni population was a small sect within the Iraqi framework, dominating an overwhelming Sunni majority. So in some ways, it's almost Iraq on its head. It flipped over.
Right.
But you
And of
also
course,
have
the
Christian
Assads.
minorities in Syria that have been brought into kind of this coalition of minorities that are been in charge of the country. But to be clear, it's not that it's Christians and Alawis versus the Sunnis. You have Christians on both sides of this conflict too, which makes the whole idea of vetting people's religion coming into the U.S. Has been proposed in recent legislation, just absolutely absurd, as if it would make sense no matter what side they were on. But there's Christians on both sides, and frankly, both sides are considered enemies by the U.S.
Right, and but so it's not only impractical. It is, as you say, absurd. That's a great point, as well as being morally profoundly offensive and against
Of course.
everything this country is supposed to stand for. So Eric, as we're starting to run out of time, so what's
Mhm.
next for you in your efforts and all this? Where are you going next? What are you doing next?
Sure. So I'm going to be heading next to Lesbos island right off the coast of Turkey, and really one of the largest, I don't know what you call it, an influx country, where people coming from Syria passing through Turkey as a transit country are finding themselves. I mean, we're talking like, if I've got my numbers right, maybe 70 boats a day packed full of
Mm.
people in some places on the coast. So I'm going to be heading there just to kind of do my own thing with my two hands on the ground, and also try and assess things visually, but really just to participate in a different way, to actually just see what skills I can bring to offer in the situation. After that, I'm heading to Egypt in January, which has its own significant Syrian population in the context of the war, and I'll be working on some of my programming there.
Well, I hope you'll stay in touch with us and give us an update from Lesbos and eventually from Egypt. Um, Eric Maddox, director of the Open Roads Media Project and founder and executive director of the Virtual Dinner Guest Project. And there's the Facebook page. I believe it's Refugee Relief Action Program, right?
Refugee Relief Action Forum.
Forum. Okay,
Yeah,
great. And I hope folks will check that out as well. And as always, thanks for coming on the show.
it's been great. Thanks for having me.
You bet.